Thank you. Thank you, my friend. Thank you, Walter. It's always a pleasure to do anything with the Humanities Center. The Humanities Center and the Conehatta Center, we do things together all the time. Can everybody hear me? Can hear me? Just give me a little nod if you can hear me. Okay, that's good. But before I start, I want to welcome everyone. I know my own students from my own course that I'm teaching right now on this subject. This is our second class meeting and they are here as well. So I would just say that for them, the overview I'm going to give right now, think of it in, if this was a classic Broadway show, what you're going to hear today is the overture. I'm going to lay out a lot of the broader themes, and subsequently in class, we're going to elaborate on them. I also want to give a shout out, a special welcome to the students at the Frankel Jewish Academy who are joining us on Zoom today as well. So our topic for today, challenging and defining anti-Semitism, the longest hatred. It's a topic that's at once familiar, I would say, but in some ways unfamiliar. In other words, we all know, most of us know something about it. We have an opinion about it. We read about it. Many of us have experienced it, but there are subtleties and aspects of it that we don't always understand. And I think especially these days get muddled. So the two things I would like to do today, the two questions I would like to address is, first of all, what does the term anti-Semitism mean? Defining the term. And secondly, a related question, what should be included in the category of anti-Semitism? Now, some things are obvious. Hitler, Nazism, the Holocaust, that's obvious. The shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue a couple of years ago, that's obvious. But there are also less obvious examples or more subtle examples. So the trick with understanding anti-Semitism is not only understanding what it means, but also understanding its parameters and what lies in and what lies beyond. And even in recent times, even in the last few days, we've had instances come up where it's unclear if something is anti-Semitic or not. I'll give you the most recent example is last week, Jon Stewart, former host of The Daily Show, he was on a podcast and somehow the subject of Harry Potter came up and he made an offhand remark, a humorous remark to the effect that in Harry Potter, the people who work at Gringotts Bank are goblins and they all look like Jews. And why is J.K. Rowling having the Jews run the bank, which of course is an old anti-Semitic stereotype and trope. And so Newsweek magazine reported immediately that Jon Stewart was calling J.K. Rowling anti-Semitic, to which he responded, that's not at all true. So there's an example of, was that anti-Semitic or not? Hopefully by the end, we can return to examples like this and have a clearer sense as to how to understand a moment like that. But the question as to what's anti-Semitism it doesn't only revolve around individual events in the news. There are also scholarly debates and disagreements as to how to define the term. And I'll just give you two recent examples. There were two organizations, two collections of scholars that attempted to articulate a concise definition of anti-Semitism. One was a group known as the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Their definition was very succinct, but it was deemed problematic by some because there was too much emphasis on one aspect or one current, let's call it, aspect of anti-Semitism that's a matter of debate, whether or not criticism of the state of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism, something I will return to a little bit later. In response to that, another group known as the Jerusalem Declaration, they came up with a broader definition, a more inclusive definition. Okay, thank you, Brad, for posting that in the chat. So we have competing definitions. So how are we to define it? So let's do that. Let's define anti-Semitism, what the term means, and then let's look at some different manifestations and how we can create parameters and how we can create standards by which to evaluate whether something is anti-Semitic or not. So in terms of defining the term anti-Semitism, let me start by introducing two additional terms, one of which I imagine some of you have heard, the other which I imagine few, if any, of you have heard. So the term that I'm imagining few, if any of you have heard, is the term allo-Semitism. Now, allo-Semitism, A-L-L-O Semitism, this is the notion that Jews are different. They are different from everyone else. Now, Allo-Semitism is a broad term. It's also an umbrella term for two other terms, one of which is the one I think might be familiar to you, Phylosemitism. And the other dimension of Allo-Semitism is anti-Semitism. Now, Phylosemitism is a notion that Jews are different in a positive way, and anti-Semitism is the notion that Jews are different in a negative way. So anti-Semitism is familiar, and we'll talk about that. But just to be clear, this notion of Phylosemitism, I just want to make it clear. Let me give you a couple of examples and also explain why it's problematic. So an example of Phylosemitism would be, all Jews are smart. Doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that. It sounds like a compliment. It might even be intended as a compliment. But the problem with saying all Jews are smart is the fact that there's a very short step between saying all Jews are smart and all Jews are cunning, or all Jews are shrewd. Similarly, all Jews are good at business is another example of Phylosemitism. There's a very fine line between saying all Jews are good at business and all Jews are cheap, or all Jews are Shylock. So Phylosemitism, while it doesn't appear to be problematic, it is. And what it tells us is that both Phylosemitism and anti-Semitism are two sides of the same coin, Allo-Semitism. And the fundamental problem here is presuming that Jews are inherently and inescapably different than everyone else. So I wanted to start with that. Now let me add this. When we use the term anti-Semitism, we use it in two very different ways. Let's call one the colloquial way, how we use it in popular parlance, and then there's the more technical historical definition. So the way the term anti-Semitism is used in popular discourse, it's a catch-all. It's an umbrella term for all forms of Jew hatred from antiquity all the way to the present. All forms. Strictly speaking, historically, the term was originally defined to refer to something much more specific. Namely, it was referred to refer to Jew hatred that is racial and political in nature. Now, look, for the purposes of today, I'm going to use it in the colloquial sense because there's really no other word that's as convenient to use. But I just want you to be aware that when the term was originally defined, as we shall see, it had a very specific meaning, but when I say anti-Semitism today, I'm going to use it in this broad catch-all, referring to all forms of Jew hatred meaning. Now, apart from saying that the word is used differently, it has different meanings, it's also important to note that not all forms of anti-Semitism are the same as all other forms of anti-Semitism. So first, I would say all forms of anti-Semitism, like all forms of racism and discrimination and prejudice, they are reprehensible. But with anti-Semitism, we can define forms of anti-Semitism into different categories. For example, we can distinguish violent anti-Semitism from non-violent anti-Semitism. Both reprehensible, but those are two different things. Similarly, within the realm of nonviolent anti-Semitism, we can distinguish polemical anti-Semitism, meaning anti-Semitic speech, anti-Semitic writing, from systemic anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish.
And I feel like racism should stop.
Anti-Jewish.
Racism is bad.
Someone's mute is not on out there. Thank you. Okay. So we have these different forms, and one other term or concept that's important to note when we talk about different notions of anti-Semitism.
And Jacqueline, you black ass, all offense to you.
Is the term Judeophobia. Judeophobia means fear of Jews, but when we say Judeophobia, we're not only talking about a fear of Jews. Remember, when we talk about a phobia, we generally refer not to a fear, but it's an irrational fear. And Judeophobia, a fear of Jews, has been a dimension of anti-Semitism, as we shall see, all the way since antiquity. So anti-Semitism has meant not only a disdain for Jews or Jew hatred, but it's also meant a fear of Jews. In that sense, the term Judeophobia is parallel to the term Islamophobia. They both refer to not only disdain, but also fear. Let's think more broadly and look at how anti-Semitism as a phenomena has manifested at different points in time. In discussing the different ways that anti-Semitism has manifested, I think useful here would make use of a concept that was defined by a historian of science named Thomas Kuhn. Now, Kuhn wasn't talking about anti-Semitism. He wasn't even talking about history exactly. He was talking about scientific revolutions, but he talked about the concept of a paradigm. He said that whatever you're talking about, whatever your subject is, whatever topic or whatever phenomenon, it can, at different periods of time, it can go through it can express itself in a particular way, which is called a paradigm. And then at some point, it will shift to a different paradigm. So when we talk about physics, for example, the paradigm in physics was the physics of Isaac Newton for a long time. But this Newtonian paradigm was replaced by Einstein physics, okay? Now, when we talk about paradigms in the history of anti-Semitism, we're really talking about three stages, and I want to describe each one of them to you briefly. So the first stage, and this is a stage which begins in antiquity. This is the form of anti-Semitism that was dominant from antiquity all the way to the mid-19th century. And this is an anti-Semitism which was predominantly religion-based, religious-based anti-Semitism. Now, it existed primarily in the world of Christendom, while there were forms of Jew hatred in the Muslim world. It's never as pronounced as it was in the world of Christendom, and especially in the world of European Christendom. Okay, and the reason for this and the basis of this religious-based anti-Semitism, and this is something familiar, and that was an accusation against Jews of a very serious crime, a crime called deicide. In other words, Christians believed that Jews were guilty of murdering Christ, but that wasn't just an accusation of a single crime. That accusation had profound implications associated with it. So eventually, it began as Jews being accused of killing Christ, but that accusation evolved into what became, we might call the original Jewish conspiracy. Jews conspired with the devil, not only to kill Christ per se, but to drive good from the world. And Jews became the personification of evil in the world, or at least the agent of bringing evil into the world. And it was natural at that point. Once you assume that Jews are in league with Satan, it was easy to accuse Jews of other crimes, like murdering Christian children or poisoning wells. And that was the dominant form of anti-Semitism all the way really into the mid-19th century. I should also say that accusation has had some real teeth to it. That accusation against Jews was still in place even in the 1960s. The Catholic Church forgave Jews of that crime in 1963, the Lutheran Church in 1998. It was a deeply rooted problem. So that was paradigm number one. In that sense, anti-Semitism all the way until the 19th century was a fairly straightforward proposition. It was religious-based. It was really derived from a single religious-based accusation of deicide. But the story gets more problematic and more complex when we get to the Age of Enlightenment. And here, that paradigm of religious-based anti-Semitism, its limitations begin to show. Now, where does it begin to show? Here, the example, and the transition point here. The transitional instance and the transitional individual was a German composer whose name was Richard Wagner. You see, Wagner had a problem. Wagner, Wagner was an enlightened person. He was a product of the European Enlightenment, which means he was not a religious person. He was Christian, but had abandoned most Christian ideas. He didn't believe in the crucifixion. He didn't believe in any of that. He was an enlightened person, but he still didn't like Jews. And so when he tried to understand, why is it I don't like Jews, he couldn't resort to the classic religious explanations because he didn't believe in any of that. So he had to come up with a new explanation. And in 1850, he wrote a book called Jews in Music. He was a composer. He was a premier German composer. And he wrote a book called Jews in Music. And listen, let me read you something he wrote in this book where he's explaining, he's coming up with a way to not like Jews, that doesn't require religious belief. Quote, "Here then we touch the point that brings us closer to our main inquiry. We have to explain to ourselves the involuntary repellence possessed for us by the nature and personality of Jews, so as to vindicate that instinctive dislike which we plainly recognize as stronger and more overpowering than the conscious zeal to rid ourselves thereof." In other words, I think religion is this bunch of nonsense, but I still don't like Jews. That's his problem. Now, what was it? He found his answer in culture. What Wagner said in this book called Jews and Music is that when Jews contribute, in this case, to German culture, there's always going to be something inherently Jewish about it. He was a composer, and he believed that if a Jew composed a piece of music, even if he or she used exactly the same notes and the same dynamics, and everything was exactly the same as music composed, the same music composed by a Christian composer, the music would be somehow different. It would be tainted. It would be lesser. It would be Jewish. And the same thing, not only with music, but with art and with literature and with language. There was something inherently Jewish. So he explained it in terms of culture. He found a way to understand why he didn't like Jews without having to resort to religion. This is a new paradigm. Now, the language he didn't have, which he discovered shortly after writing this book, was the language and terminology and concept of race. Now, around the same time he was writing this book, the division of humanity into races was really coming into being. Race science divided into humanity into groups known as races, and Jews were part of the Caucasian race, but their subgroup was the Semitic race. The Semitic race included Jews and Arabs. Germans were part of a different race. Now, originally, race science was simply dividing humanity into races. But soon after, this new race science was kind of like this human genome, so to speak, combined with another social scientific discipline called social Darwinism, which claimed that different groups within humanity are competing with each other for survival, in the same way that, according to Darwinism, different species in nature compete for survival. So this notion of social Darwinism, when it applied to race, it said that different races can only survive at the expense of others. And there were those who were like-minded, like Wagner, who reached the conclusion that the Jewish race was competing for survival with other races. Now, one of the people who believed that, who really the first to articulate that idea, was a German sociologist named Wilhelm Maher. He is the guy who coined the term anti-Semitism in 1879. And what he meant by anti-Semitism, the ism part of anti-Semitism is an ideology or a movement. It believes that the Jewish race is inherently at war, in a struggle for survival with other races, and the only way other races can survive is by defeating the Jewish race. And he didn't think that was a conflict that had yet to happen. The book he wrote, where he defined anti-Semitism, was called The War Between Jews and Germans. Actually, let me correct that. It was called The Victory of Jews over Germans. In his mind, the Jewish race was already winning and had to be stopped. And this is the notion, first of all, that Jews are a distinct race and not simply a religious group. Secondly, that there was reason not only to disdain this Jewish race, but to fear them as well. That there is an element of Judeophobia here. If you believe that the Jewish race is defeating your own, and the Jewish race threatens your race's survival, then obviously you are going to regard the Jews as not only disdainful, but also threatening. So that notion of Judeophobia is present here as well. Now, there's this new concept of anti-Semitism. It resonated very deeply, particularly with certain people in Europe, with certain Europeans. There was those who, I'll put it this way, there were Europeans who felt victimized by the changes of the 19th century. They felt victimized by urbanization, industrialization, secularization, liberalism, all of those things. Those who, and they saw the Jews as the principal beneficiaries of those changes. So for them, this idea of a race war between the Jewish race and other races made sense. It helped explain their own decline and their own difficulties in their own lifetime. And this was true of peasants who had lost their farms. This was true of workers. This was true of artisans who were competed out of existence by large industry. This was true of those who remembered a time when the Catholic Church was still dominant, which it no longer was, and were dismayed by waves of religious indifference. The Jews became the natural target. And it was a way to explain also how a marginal group like the Jews had gone from being ostracized at the beginning of the 19th century to not only citizens, but also upwardly mobile and relatively successful within European society. So it captured all these things together. Now, that new notion of racially based anti-Semitism was different from that earlier religious-based anti-Semitism in one important, well, at least in one important way. Religious-based anti-Semitism, if you were Jewish and facing it, you had an automatic escape route. If you converted to Christianity, it went away. It left you, you were left alone. There were exceptions, but we don't have to deal with them now. For the most part, the moment you became a Christian, because the disdain for and fear of Jews was based in religious terms, if you became a Christian, you didn't get bothered anymore. But racial anti-Semitism, the notion of race is something inescapable, no matter what you do. So to come back to Wagner and that book, he wrote that book, Jews in Music. His principal target was a composer whose name was Felix Mendelsohn Bartholdi, who most of you have never heard of, but you've all heard, I think, of at least one of his songs. This is the composer who wrote the Wedding March. Da, 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 da. He wrote beautiful music, but Wagner singled him out as an example of the way that Jewish composers ruin music. But the weird thing is, and for us, the very telling thing is that Mendelssohn was not Jewish. He was converted to Christianity as a child by his parents. So religiously, he was Christian, but in Wagner's view of the world, racially, he was permanently Jewish. Similarly, another example was the Prime Minister of England in the mid-19th century, Benjamin Disraeli, who had converted to Christianity from Judaism as a boy, but everyone thought of him as the Jewish prime minister. Race was something inescapable. Now, this racial anti-Semitism combined with a political sort of anti-Semitism. Now, this political anti-Semitism, we can almost pinpoint its beginning in a single series of events, a series of revolutions in 1848. There were a series of liberal revolutions in Europe. Long story short, they tried to do in Central Europe what happened in Western Europe in 1789, okay? Now, here's the thing. The largest of these revolutions was in Vienna, and the leader of the revolution of 1848 in Vienna was a Jewish doctor named Adolf Fischhoff. And because of that, out of these revolutions, there emerged a stereotype that all Jews are revolutionaries and all revolutionaries are Jews. And later, that notion of all Jews being revolutionaries would be restated as all Jews are communists or Bolsheviks, and all communists or Bolsheviks are Jews. But in 1848, there's another part of the story. These revolutions were ultimately defeated, and the reason they were defeated is that the powers that be were able to muster their armies. And they were able to do that because they were funded more or less by a single wealthy, powerful Jewish family, the Rothschilds. And so a second stereotype emerged from these same events, the notion that all Jews are counter-revolutionaries. All Jews are conservative reactionaries. And so after 1848, if you were someone on the political left and you didn't like Jews, all Jews were Rothschilds. If you were someone on the political right and you didn't like Jews, all Jews were fishhoffs. But you see, it isn't only, this is the beginnings of anti-Semitism from the left and from the right, but it's also building into that notion that Jews are to be feared, this notion of Judeophobia, that Jews are disproportionately powerful and influential. Now, that didn't always coincide with reality. Jews were a minuscule minority in Europe. There were no kings in Europe or royal families in Europe who were Jewish. So there was a need to explain, how is it that this small minority is exerting such a disproportionate amount of influence, starting revolutions and ending revolutions? How to explain that? And this was explained in the emergence of a new conspiracy theory about Jews in the 1880s. And this conspiracy theory was known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, we now know this was a forgery that was written by the Russian secret police in the 1880s to discredit Jews and to undermine the image of Jews. But as a text, it had a remarkable life as a published text. If you Google Protocols of the Elders of Zion right now, which I imagine those people trolling in, I bet they read it all the time. If you do that, you'll see it's been translated into dozens of languages. It is readily available. So what is in this text? Well, it purports to describe the meetings of a group. Protocols just means minutes of a meeting. The meetings of a secret group called the Elders of Zion. This was a secret conspiracy, a cabal of powerful Jews, and this is what they talk about at their meetings. Now, what's remarkable is they're not planning world domination. According to these minutes of these meetings, they've already achieved it. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion not only talks about future, what this conspiracy of Jews wants to do, but what they have done. And it explains historical events in terms of a Jewish conspiracy. Now, before I give you an example, let me just note that what makes conspiracy theories effective is they require not one shred of evidence. If someone believes the conspiracy to be true, then everything else follows. If you think the conspiracy is nonsense, it all doesn't make any sense. So I'll give you an example. How did the Protocols of the Elders of Zion explain what was the French Revolution really about? It wasn't about peasants overthrowing the king or a revolt against the monarchy. It was the Jewish middle class co-opting the support of Christian peasants without them knowing it to overthrow the nobility of Europe to make the Jewish middle class more powerful. Similarly, what was socialism and social revolution really about? It was Jewish industrialists, Jewish capitalists co-opting workers to destroy Christian capitalists. And every development is explained as a Jewish conspiracy. Also in this conspiracy theory, it is explained, how are they doing it? How are they pulling it off? And here the Protocols makes the simple claim: Jews control media. Jews control the flow of information. Jews control how events are perceived. And once you assume that Jews are controlling the spread of information, everything we know is now seen through a lens of a Jewish conspiracy, if you think that conspiracy actually exists. But it's building on this notion that Jews have taken over the world. So you can see anti-Semitism has shifted from something religious to something racial and political, but that Judeophobia element is still there, and that notion of a Jewish conspiracy is still at the heart of it, and it had great appeal. Now, eventually, this racial and political anti-Semitism and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion made their way to America. In the 20th century, American anti-Semitism in many ways was shaped by both, but there was a particular spin on anti-Semitism in America, particularly after the First World War. From the First World War on, anti-Semitism in America was really a symptom of a larger anti-immigrant xenophobia. If you know your American history, you know that during and after World War I, there's a period of isolationism. there is a period when America wants to turn away from the rest of the world, a kind of America First ideology, and what had been an open policy on immigration for several decades, when several million Jews, along with 20 million people had arrived, was reversed. And suddenly immigrants were seen as the ultimate outsiders. But this xenophobia was directed towards all immigrants, all people who were different, but Jews were singled out as the most dangerous of immigrants. This was especially true and really driven forward in the writings of Henry Ford. Our own Henry Ford in Detroit, probably the premier anti-Semite, maybe that's the wrong term, the most notorious anti-Semite, if not in American history, certainly in the 1920s and 20th century. In his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, the very first essay he wrote in the very first edition that he published was called The International Jew, the World's Problem, where he reiterated the elements of racial and political anti-Semitism. And he translated the Protocols of the Elders of Zion into English and published them for an English reading audience. And he was writing this at a time when the US Congress was becoming more anti-immigrant and more xenophobic, and all this xenophobia and all this fear of Jews. It culminated in the passage of an anti-immigration bill in 1924 called the Johnson-Reed Act, which, while not specifically mentioning Jews, effectively brought Jewish immigration to America to an end, or at least to a trickle. It singled out Jews. And the mantra they used that really drove this, and one of the things Henry Ford would repeat again, is this notion that all Jews are communists. There were communist revolutions going on in Russia and in Hungary and in Germany, and Ford and other anti-Semites said, if we allow Jews to keep coming in, Jewish communists are going to bring that revolutionary upheaval to America. And it has to be stopped. If you think about it, there's a kind of parallel between Judeophobia of the 1920s and Islamophobia of the 21st century. All you have to do is replace the mantra, all Jews are communists, with the mantra, all Muslims are terrorists, and you have almost exactly the same thing. Okay. Now, so this was that second stage, that second paradigm, racial and political anti-Semitism. But it also eventually reached a point of limitation. And that limitation really was Hitler and Nazism, because by the end of the Second World War, to be a racial anti-Semite, even if you weren't a Nazi, even if you were an opponent of Hitler, to express anti-Semitism in racial terms, I would say to be a racist generally, you were lumped in together, or you risked being lumped together with Hitler and Nazism and associated with the Holocaust. Now, some people are okay with that. You know, white nationalists, white supremacists, they had no problem being associated with Hitler. But most people who didn't like Jews, I would say, still didn't want to be associated with Hitler, because Hitler was Hitler. And who wants to be associated with Hitler? So after the Second World War, we reached what we might call a third stage, or a third paradigm of anti-Semitism, which in many ways is the one we're in now. Now, first, I would emphasize that there is still religious-based hatred of Jews. There is still racial and politically based hatred of Jews. You know, we still have the anti-Semitism of the left and the anti-Semitism of the right. But what's happened since the Second World War, two things have happened, particularly in America. First, an issue came up, a point of debate came up, which I would describe as the whiteness of white-presenting American Jews. In other words, white-presenting Jews in America, are they really white or not? Now, it might seem obvious one way or the other, but the fact of the matter is the question is more complicated, because, well, let me put it this way. I'll put it very succinctly, okay? Today, and I'd say since the Second World War at least, if not before, for those people who consider whiteness to be a virtue, Jews are not white, or at least they're not as white as other people who are white, because for many people who consider whiteness to be a virtue, to be white is not only defined by race or by skin tone, it is also defined by religion. To be white, to be truly white, means being Christian. In some cases, not only Christian, it means being Protestant Christian. And so if you're Jewish, by definition, you can't be white. Now, for those people for whom whiteness is a virtue, is a vice, they've tended to see Jews as white. And so American Jews since the Second World War have been in a position where from both sides, the whiteness of Jews is used as a kind of cudgel against Jews. Now, one thing is certainly true. Jews can pass more easily as white than people of color can pass as white. That is certainly true. And I mean white presenting Jews. Jews of color obviously is a separate situation and a separate talk. But for Jews, even though it's easier to pass as white, there is a price associated with it. If you are a white presenting Jew and you want to pass as white, you can, but you can't be too Jewish. You can't be too visibly Jewish. And it's certainly true, not only in this country, in our own city. If you open up the pages of, let's say, the Detroit Free Press or the Detroit News, as late as the 1950s and even into the 1960s, you will see ads for houses and apartments, which will say, no blacks, no Jews. You will see job applications, which will say no blacks, no Jews. Jews faced discrimination in terms of job, in terms of where they could live. One of the reasons why the Jewish community of Detroit, when they left Detroit, when they migrated, went northwest and not northeast, is the neighborhoods immediately northeast of Detroit didn't want Jews in there. Northwest in some ways was the only direction they could go. So there was a sense of discrimination here. And there was this kind of anti-Semitism which percolated in American society. Now, how it compares to other forms, that I think is still a matter of debate, but it was certainly there. You want to get a sense of it. You should take a look. The winner for Best Picture in 1947 was a film called Gentleman's Agreement, starring Gregory Peck. Long story short, he goes undercover. He's not Jewish, but he pretends to be Jewish just to see how people treat him. And wow, that kind of social discrimination he encounters is very serious. For example, the reason the movie is called Gentleman's Agreement is he tries to check into a hotel and they won't let him because there is this gentleman's agreement that Jews are not allowed to stay in this hotel. So there is this form of discrimination. So one element of this latest stage, this latest paradigm of anti-Semitism is difficult to define because it revolves around this question of the whiteness of Jews. The other dimension of it is clear. And really, I would say, since the Second World War, increasingly, the main manifestation of anti-Semitism has been anti-Zionism. Now let's come back. Remember we said Wagner. Wagner was not a religious person. He needed a way to be anti-Semitic without being religious. In the aftermath of Hitler and the Holocaust, people who didn't like Jews, who wanted to express it, it was difficult to express it in racial terms because you would be associated with Hitler. But the way around that is you would express that disdain for Jews as a disdain for a Jewish state, the state of Israel. Okay? Now, this is the ultimate in complicated issues. So I'm going to try to unravel it. But the first thing I'm going to say as a disclaimer right here is that while we've had over almost 200 years to understand racial and political anti-Semitism and centuries to understand religious anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism is a relatively recent phenomena. And in all honesty, we are still figuring it out. Okay. Let me say from the outset, in trying to really, in trying to flesh it out, in trying to categorize the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, or the relationship between criticism of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism, is made more difficult because of two, I would call them simplistic, one-dimensional approaches to this problem. So let me tell what these two one-dimensional approaches are. Okay, there is a point of view which says that any criticism of the state of Israel, any criticism is by definition anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, any criticism. Now, that is ridiculously simplistic. Any criticism? Am I not allowed to say if I say anything disparaging about the state of Israel, it makes me an anti-Semite? I don't think so. If I, for example, if I stick up for the women who want to pray at the Western Wall in defiance of an Israeli policy, is that anti-Semitic? Or a movement like Chabad didn't recognize the state of Israel until the 1950s. Were they anti-Semitic until then? I don't think so. It's just too simplistic and one-dimensional. Now, the other simplistic and one-dimensional approach to the problem is that Zionism is inherently racist and colonialist, as is the state of Israel. And the state of Israel, because of its treatment of the Palestinians, is an illegitimate state and therefore must cease to exist. So we have these two one-dimensional approaches to the problem, both of which are, to my mind, flawed. The problem is, in each case, there is merit. There are some critics of the state of Israel who are using that criticism as a way to be anti-Semitic without sounding racist, no question about it. Okay, and of course, there are policies of the state of Israel which are enormously problematic. So how do we draw the line, or where do we draw the line between criticism of the state of Israel, which is just that, criticism of the state of Israel, and criticism of the state of Israel, which is a vehicle to express something anti-Semitic without sounding racist? So let me try to define it by example. All right, and I'm going to give you two, maybe three examples here. Example number one is a philosopher, a philosopher historian. His name is Cornel West, who has taught at Harvard and Princeton. He, to my mind, is one of the best thinkers we have right now. He is a severe critic of the state of Israel. He calls the state of Israel out for its human rights violations of Palestinians all the time. Okay, so by that first one-dimensional approach, he would automatically, in a knee-jerk way, be classified as anti-Semitic. Here's the problem, though. Cornel West doesn't only criticize the state of Israel for its human rights violations. He criticizes every country in the world, every instance of human violations, including those in our own country. He doesn't single out the state of Israel. In fact, he's equal in his criticism. He hands it out. He criticizes everybody. He's consistent. And for that reason, I would say that while Cornel West is a severe opponent of the state of Israel and challenges its right to exist, the claim that he is anti-Semitic just doesn't hold water. On the other hand, here's a counterexample or a different example. There is a committee associated with the United Nations, the United Nations Human Rights Council, which does great work in many ways. But when it comes to calling out countries for human rights violations, well, it's called out a lot of different countries. It's called out human rights violations all over the world, and it's called out the state of Israel for its human rights violations, rightfully so. But here's the problem. The United Nations Human Rights Council has condemned the state of Israel for human rights violations more than it has condemned every other country combined. There's an imbalance there. Let me give one other example, and then we can conclude and maybe take some questions. Okay, I'm going to offer an extreme example here. Let me ask the question: an organization like Hamas, are they anti-Semitic or simply at war with the state of Israel? Okay, now by that first notion, that notion that any criticism or any challenge to the state of Israel is anti-Semitic, the answer would be yes. But if you presume that the state of Israel has forfeited right to exist, maybe not. Here's how I would answer the question. If you read the Hamas charter very closely, I would say that other than Article 28, the argument could be made that Hamas is engaged in a war, and Hamas is overly violent and commits reprehensible acts of violence, but not necessarily anti-Semitic. It is focused against a political entity known as the State of Israel, other than Article 28. The problem is that their charter includes Article 28, which says the following, okay? Quote, the Zionist invasion is a vicious invasion. Fine. It does not refrain from resorting from all methods, using all evil and contemptible ways to achieve its end. Okay? Still not necessarily anti-Semitic. It relies greatly in its infiltration and espionage operations on the secret organizations it gave rise to, such as the Freemasons, the Rotary and Lions Clubs, and other sabotage groups. All these organizations, whether secret or open, work in the interest of Zionism and according to its instructions. They are aimed at undermining societies, destroying values, corrupting consciences, deteriorating characters, and annihilating Islam. Now that's a problem, because this notion of working in secret, giving rise to secret societies like the Freemasons, that could have been cut and pasted out of the protocols of the elders of Zion. The minute that Hamas, in its founding principles, ceases to talk specifically about its military and political conflict with the state of Israel, and begins to talk about the state of Israel as part of a world Jewish conspiracy, then it has entered the realm of anti-Semitism. Now, I would say if they took that article out, I think it becomes questionable as to whether or not they're anti-Semitic. Violent, yes. Reprehensible in many ways, yes. Anti-Semitic, not necessarily. But with that article, it's very, very different. So where do we wind up? Well, remember at the outset we said that the anti-Semitism is an example of allosemitism. And what really has defined anti-Semitism, whether it's religious or it's racial and political or anti-Zionist manifestations, is the fact that it is singling out Jews. Jews are singled out in certain ways. And it's the singling out that's the problem. And in the same way, if you single out the one Jewish state in the world, that in essence is the same as singling out individual Jews or Jewish communities. So where does that leave us in terms of, well, how about the example I gave at the outset? What about that example from Harry Potter and the goblins? Is this something anti-Semitic? Well, it depends. Well, let's say it this way, all right? What John Stewart said in his defense, the reason John Stewart said it was not anti-Semitic is he said that this is the way goblins are drawn, and all J.K. Rowling did in this book was basically put the goblins in charge of the bank. If someone wants to see the goblins as being stereotypically Jewish, that says more about the observer than it does about the author. If someone looks at those goblins and sees, let's, for example, their physiognomy, their facial features, and says, obviously they're Jews, that says a lot about the observer as much as it does about the author. That is a questionable case. But the larger issue is an instant, and if you lump an incident like that together with more serious incidents of anti-Semitism, you wound up diluting or diminishing the severity of the latter. And really the point here, and the point of the exercise in distinguishing different forms and manifestations of anti-Semitism, the point is to create a kind of guide with how to deal with them. All forms of anti-Semitism merit a response. All forms of anti-Semitism merit a response, but they don't necessarily merit the same response. And historically, Jews have been dealing with anti-Semitism for a very long time. And whether individually, but especially communally, the best success that Jews have had in dealing with anti-Semitism is responding in a way which is proportional to the anti-Semitism itself, so that violent acts of anti-Semitism have elicited more dramatic Jewish responses. And let's say less violent or non-violent have elicited a less dramatic response. The important thing is not to lose that sense of nuance, to be able to see all of these things as examples of anti-Semitism, but to be able to differentiate one from the other. Now, it's not always easy. I'm going to give you an example of where I'll give you two examples of when it's difficult to see the anti-Semitism, maybe three examples, and that will be the end, okay? First of all, during the Second World War, there were anti-Semitic leaders in Europe who were rabidly anti-Semitic, but also anti-Nazi. For example, the president of Hungary, Miklos Horthy, was a rabid anti-Semite, but was also an avid opponent of Hitler, okay? I'll give you another example. here's an example of Phylosemitism that might sort of, that has an anti-Semitic undertone to it. All right, and this has to do with this third form of anti-Semitism. The most avid supporters of the state of Israel right now are evangelical Christians, and that's great, unless you ask the question, what is the source of their support? What is the reason of their support? Evangelical Christians do not support the state of Israel because of a love of Israel or Zionism or Jews per se. They support the state of Israel because they see the existence of the state of Israel as a step toward the rapture. Now, in case you don't know, the rapture is part of the second coming. On the day of the rapture, Jews and other non-believers are going to be given the choice between embracing Jesus Christ and death. Now, I can't speak for all Jews. I can't speak for all non-Christians, but myself, I'm not accepting Jesus Christ as my savior, even on the day of the rapture. So with regard to me, evangelicals are praying for the hasty arrival of the day of my death. I have a little problem with that. I find that to be a little bit anti-Semitic, someone praying for my death. I'm not praying for anyone's death. They're praying for my death. One last example. A corollary of this notion that any criticism of the state of Israel is by definition anti-Semitic. And I think an unexpected corollary is this notion that anyone who is supportive of the state of Israel is by definition not anti-Semitic. And that's a problem. The present president of Hungary, Viktor Orban, is an avid supporter of the state of Israel and one of the most outspoken anti-Semites in the world right now. We could maybe also put evangelicals in that category as well. It's a complicated issue. And the important thing, and the one thing you can take away is avoid one-dimensional, simplistic responses and solutions. Embrace the nuance, the complexity, the grayness of all of this. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for some questions. I think Brad, Professor Brad Roth, I see you have a question. So yes, I was hoping you did. Brad, you have a question? Maybe not. All right. Oh, you're still muted.
All right, yeah, I was being prevented. Okay, first of all, congratulations to you for having the composure to get through this really ugly incident early in the session. But I wanted to pick up on your point about the singling out, because the difficulty with this is that there are many different reasons why people prioritize issues in different ways. And particularly in terms of the United Nations system, there is a deep-seated notion, which one might accept or reject, that the original sin of the international order is Western European colonialism and its vestiges, and that therefore there is a kind of categorical priority of self-determination questions, which are related to, specifically understood, in terms of resistance to colonialism and its vestiges, vis-a-vis other kinds of human rights issues. Issues of states within their sovereign territories committing violations of human rights are basically seen as being in a separate category as systematic denials of the self-determination of another people, particularly when that is a vestige of a process that the international system has been since roughly 1960 has been seeking to repudiate and expunge as its foundation. And so I would just caution that for this reason and others, that some of the singling out that you identify with anti-Semitism, although it can certainly be a manifestation of anti-Semitism, is not just that.
Thank you. That's why it's helpful to have an expert on the United Nations and international rights in the audience. Couldn't have planned to do any better. But thank you for that question. But I understand what you're saying. But the very phenomena you've described, yes, that can apply to Israel and the Palestinians, but it can apply elsewhere as well. It still doesn't explain the imbalance, why such a high percentage, even the specific functioning of it. But your point is very well taken. Thank you, Brad. Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. This is really enlightening in many ways. And I'd love to have a serious conversation with you sometime about these three versions of anti-Semitism. I just thought I'd go from the depth of Brad Roth's remark to something a little more anecdotal. And the anecdotal remark I want to make is about the connection you made about whiteness and anti-Semitism. When I was an undergraduate many years ago at Cornell, there were 52 fraternities on campus because you're in the middle of upstate New York and there's no other way to have a social life. But there were 52 fraternities on campus, 10 of which were predominantly Jewish. But in the common parlance of the day, the other 42 were known as white.
Very exactly.
And it's for that reason when the university sends around forms wanting to know ethnicity or race, I never check white. I check other New York Jew.
Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. I mean, that's what I mean by white, but not as white as other white people. Thank you for that story. Thank you for that story. Stephen Winter.
Yeah, so following on Lawrence, I think you need to be more nuanced about that issue because sort of the similar story, you know, in the civil rights community in the 1970s, I was not white. They just did right at that. Somebody once actually said, "What's Whitey doing here?" One of my colleagues said, "He's not white, he's a Jew." Right. So it's a more complicated phenomenon.
Absolutely. That's really, you know, and that's why I wish I left more than 5 minutes to talk about it. But you're absolutely right. That's the subject of a separate talk. Thank you.
I mean,
I think
it's in the middle somewhere. It's complicated. We could be anywhere depending on the person's perspective. It's a little bit more nuanced than the version that you articulate. Also, sort of following up on, you know, on the way on Brad. So what struck me about your talk, I found very little to disagree with. What struck me about your talk, though, was until you got to America in the 1970s, your account really wasn't situated in sort of a much larger political context, or at least not adequately. So I never heard the word nationalism. And to talk about the rise of anti-Semitism in the 19th century without talking about its role in the rise of nationalism is really kind of Hamlet without the prince. And I think that that's really kind of a gaping hole. So it didn't make anything you said wrong, right, or false. I mean, right, descriptively, factually, what you were talking about Wagner and the connection, the attribution of revolution to Jews, although 1848 was not just an Eastern European phenomenon, it was a Western European phenomenon as well, but they were fighting in the streets of Paris. But it was really anti-Semitism, the othering of other people was a necessary precondition for forming a notion of a Volk, of a nation state. And this was going on everywhere in Western Europe. Not it involved Jews, it involved others, but it's Arendt's account in non-totalitarianism is that exactly that anti-Semitism in the 19th century was different, was a whole new animal from anti-Semitism historically, and the reason it was different was because of its role in the rise of nationalism. So I think you need to broaden that out.
No, I agree with you, and thank you for adding that. Again, I plead, you know, trying to fit it all in the time frame, but you're absolutely right. And Wagner is a great example of
Right.
of the quintessential German nationalist composer. Thank you, thank you. Ron, what you got for me?
I really appreciated your persistence in the face of that interruption. I don't know if I could have handled that as well as you did. I happened yesterday only to be watching the interview of Marwan Barghouti by our favorite dissident Jew, Peter Beinart, and who has managed to be called anti-Semitic for all sorts of reasons. But Peter raised the issue and Barghouti answered. I'm not sure if even if you haven't seen the lengthy interview, it's about an hour and a half. Barghouti focused on something concerning singling out. His point was that Israel singles itself out as being the only country to make citizenship not the basis of privileges and belongingness, but to make belongingness rather to Judaism the basis for all, not all privileges, but the basis for belonging in Israel. I'm sort of muddling it. Bartholdi was much sharper, but that Israel singles itself out by not having a universal citizenship, unlike we have in the United States, but rather by focusing land ownership, certain rights and privileges on Jews alone, and that there's no other country in the world that makes that kind of belonging applicable to a particular population group as opposed to all citizens. And that the criticism of Israel is not a singling out of Israel, but is a pointing out what Israel has done by singling out Jews.
Well, let me answer your question. Thank you. It's a great point. But is that necessarily true? There are citizens of Israel who are not Jewish. You don't have to be Jewish to have full civil rights in Israel. I mean, there are Palestinians who are full citizens. So what you're describing, this belongingness.
The citizens of Israel who are full citizens who happen to be Palestinians do not have the same rights to land ownership as Jews, or the same rights to move anywhere in any community, or the same school systems. In other words, there is there may be other countries that have on your identity card not only you are an American or an Israeli, but they don't have that on their identity card. They have a Palestinian or Jew. Whereas if you're French, you are French, and you have the same rights and privileges and belongingness as any other French person. You are not singled out either as positively or negatively, whereas that happens in Israel.
I agree that is a specific policy problem, but I think I would agree with you. There are definitely Israelis and Zionists who are racists, and there are laws and policies which are racist in nature. But I still don't. I think those, at least up till now, have been more anomalous than they have been mainstream. Those are, for example, they run contrary to the Declaration of Independence. That's the state of Israel departing from its own mission. And Zionist thinkers, I would say, across the spectrum from Ben Gurion all the way to Jabotinsky, would find that unacceptable. The problem is, and here in a way I'm agreeing with you. The problem is that there is influence in Israel coming from racist sectors, but I don't think, for example, from Kahanists who now have actually managed to worm their way into the Knesset. But I don't think that's a uniquely Israeli problem. Other countries, including France, have problems with inhabitants being treated and being discriminated against for reasons of race or other reasons like that. I agree with you, that problem is in Israel, but I don't agree that it's uniquely Israeli. And so if it being uniquely Israeli is the reason for Israel to be singled out, that's problematic. But I do agree that is a problem that needs to be rectified. So thank you. Edith, my colleague Edith Kovensky, I believe, do you have a question? Let me find you out there. But you have to unmute. Shalom, Edith. B'vakasha, you have to unmute.
Mute. Now can you hear me?
Yes, B'vakasha.
B'vakasha. Okay, I have two. Maybe you can explain what I've heard with my own ears in the West Bank when I actually took several times groups of students. One, I consistently heard, we are not, the Palestinians saying, we are not against the Jews. We are against the Israelis, the Zionists. How can we separate the two?
Great question. Great question. And I think, that's why I brought Hamas as a very extreme example, where much of what Hamas is aiming to do is a political and military struggle against the state. And so with these people, if that's really all they're doing, they are at war, they are at odds with the state of Israel, but not necessarily anti-Semitic. But if they're embracing the notion that the state of Israel and Zionist is inherently racist, part of a world conspiracy, that becomes problematic. But if they really say, I'll give you a personal example I had. I had occasion once to meet Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and I asked her what she thought about the situation in Israel, and she said to me, quote, "The problem is not Israel, the problem is Bibi," which means in her mind, she was willing to make that differentiation, which if that's what she really believes, and I hope it is, because I've repeated that story to like 1 million people. I hope that's, I mean, if she's being genuine there, I assume she is, then right, her problem is a political conflict with the state, not a conflict with Jews in the state. It's an important, I thank you, it's an important distinction to make. Do you have another question? Is it,
It's also, how would you explain this incident? I'm on the bus with a group of Palestinians from the believing in human rights, and I mean trying to propagate, human rights and so on, representing human rights, law students that are going to. So anyways, we are in this bus and the leader is there, and I'm giving him a book of my poetry that I was in the midst of actually giving it to the, there was a manuscript, and it's Hebrew and Arabic on both sides, side to side, and the message was clear. My message, I'm hoping for coexistence. So I'm giving him the book just to look through, and after a few minutes, he's asking me this question: how can you be a poet and a Zionist at the same time?
well, why Dafka a poet? Why wouldn't you be able to be a poet? I mean, is he assuming that to be a poet, you have to have a certain hashkafa, a certain outlook?
Well, a poet, I guess a poet is supposed to be a humanist, tolerable, liberal, more on the left, perhaps. I don't know, and
the reality is that poets, like everyone else, come in all styles and all shades.
Exactly. I mean,
there have been poets who've been horribly racist. Not great poets, but they're certainly still there. But yes.
So
yes.
Then I wanted to ask him, how do you define Zionism?
Well, that's obviously an entirely separate topic. Zionism, to put it succinctly, is the belief or the ideology that there should be a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And a core principle of Zionism across the spectrum, everyone from Ben Gurion to Jabotinsky believed that state had to be both Jewish and democratic.
Right.
The Jewish and democratic part are both non-negotiable, which is why the current situation of the Palestinians is so problematic, not only from the Palestinian point of view, but also from the Zionist point of view. It needs to be rectified, and hopefully one day it will. So thank you.
Because I think Zionism at first was really inclusive. It was
it's really, like I said, even Jabotinsky and Begin would have a problem with this. It's there are now voices that are, let's say, beyond Jabotinsky and Begin. It really comes down to I don't want to just single out, but Kahanis racists, they're the crux of the problem here, and their influence. But anyway, that's the subject of a separate talk. So thank you, Toda. Thank you for those important questions. Eric.
Hello, Professor. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
So through listening to you and the many conversations I've had with you previously and just listening osmosis to everybody else, it feels like the difference, there's a specific part that I wanted to focus on. The kind of anti-Semitism that comes from the world, and by the world I mean like your usual anti-Semites like the Wagner, Ford, people who are propagating classical Catholic or Protestant stuff, stuff that comes from like, French nationalism, German nationalism, not accepting Jews as citizens, all of that stuff. That's one thing. And I think that anti-Semitism that comes from many Palestinians is a specific kind of thing that isn't quite the same, because as Israel paints itself as the only protector of Jews around the world, the only true Jewish state, etc., Palestinians who may harbor a hatred or a disdain or just a distrust of the state of Israel and its institutions, if the state of Israel is painting itself as like the patron of Jews everywhere, I think it would be pretty easy for a Palestinian who has suffered from Israeli mistreatment to just be like, to just slide into like general Jewish hatred. And that's still bad, but the source of that isn't quite the same. Because I think if you trace the source back, a lot of that doesn't come from like a general hatred of Jews or a fear of Jews. It's a disdain for the state of Israel itself. And since the state of Israel represents it the way, since the state of Israel represents itself the way it does, and since generally speaking, when you feel like somebody is oppressing you, everybody who looks like them just seems to adopt the same attributes. Like they may first encounter one Israeli soldier, which may generalize to any Israeli soldier, which may generalize to any Jew. And it's just like, well, I'm scared of Jews because all the people that I've met that are Jews have done bad things to me, which is somewhat understandable from a specifically Palestinian perspective. Which isn't, but the generalization itself, the where it goes, is still bad. But I think that understanding where that generalization comes from is important, and distinguishing it from the historical 1900-year-long stuff that has been going on in most of the rest of the world. Am I making sense?
You made very good sense. Thank you, Eric. That's an excellent comment, as usual. So I agree with much of what you say, that part of the problem here is the state of Israel representing itself as somehow the leadership of Jews worldwide. But I would also add that that's a relatively recent development. You know, in 1950, the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, he had a meeting, or let's say an exchange, with the leader of American Jewry, Edward Blaustein, where they basically made an agreement that there's going to be a connection between diaspora Jews and Israel, but the state of Israel is going to be one distinct Jewish entity, and diaspora Jewry would also manage its own affairs. So that blurring of the distinction between the state of Israel, the Jewish state, and the Jewish diaspora, that is something which is more recent, and that is something which was really brought to the forefront more by Bibi Netanyahu than everybody else. That rhetoric of Israel speaks for everyone, and and as you say, this connection between Israel and other Jews, it begins to reverberate more deeply. That's a relatively recent thing, and I agree with you. That's a problem. That's the state of Israel, in some ways, forgetting what originally it was intended to be. It's a place of refuge for Jews, which has been historically necessary for those Jews, but it's not supposed to. The state of Israel is not supposed to be sort of the government of the Jewish diaspora. So the problem you identify is a correct one, but it's also a relatively recent one. And it's out of sync with what the state of Israel's attitude toward the diaspora, I'd say before 10 or 15, but before the Bibi era. I think it's a specifically Bibi problem, but thank you.
Howard,
Nadav, what you got?
yes. Howard, can you make Nadav the last question?
Yes, Nadav, you get the last word, or you get the second last word. I get the last word.
I think, well, thank you, Dr. Lupovitch, for this really great discussion here. I wanted to address Professor Kavensky's point. I think it's important to understand that especially in Israel, the question of separating Jewishness and Zionism from each other. When that Palestinian says, how can you be a poet and a Zionist, or the other anecdote about the question of separating Jewishness and Zionism, it's difficult because those concepts are linked as a direct consequence of how Israeli national identity is formulated. If the question of full citizenship, of full rights, of the right to participate in civil society, in religious society, and in all of those things is about being Jewish, and that it's not an accident that is how it is received, as Eric said so beautifully, by Palestinians as two fundamentally connected things.
Thank you, Nadav. That's a very good point. And it really points to the fact that this is the subject of a separate talk, that the state of Israel, this is what I mean, it was founded to be both Jewish and democratic, which means all people who live there have the right, have the same full civil rights and the right to express themselves fully, while at the same time the state has a Jewish character for other reasons, for specific reasons. But thank you, that's a very, very good point. I think that's going to be our last question. So I thank everyone for coming. Thank you for being patient, bearing out that bizarre little beginning. That was the first for me. And I appreciate everyone coming.